Thank you for joining us this evening. You're now attending the webinar entitled In the Shadow of Civil Rights, the African American Experience in New York City in the 1980s. Our leader for this session is Hasan Kwame Jeffries, Associate Professor, Department of History, The Ohio State University. Hasan Kwame Jeffries is the College of Arts and Sciences Alumni Associate Professor of History at the Ohio State University, where he teaches courses on the civil rights and Black Power movement. Hasan was born in Brooklyn, New York, and graduated summa cum laude from Morehouse College with a BA in History in 1994. At Morehouse, he was initiated into the Pi chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. He earned a PhD in American History with a specialization in African American History from Duke University. Hasan is the author of Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, which tells the remarkable story of the African American freedom movements in Lowndes County, Alabama, the birthplace of Black Power. He is also the editor of Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, a collection of essays by leading civil rights scholars and teachers that explores how to teach the civil rights movement accurately and effectively. Hasan's current book project, In the Shadow of Civil Rights, examines the Black experience in New York City from 1977 to 1993. It connects key political and cultural events, such as the Youth Rebellion in the South Bronx, to the evolution and implementation of public policies that change Black communities forever, such as those that undergird the war on drugs. The book aims to provide a new narrative of the Black experience in the post-civil rights era. Hasan consults regularly with school districts on developing anti-racism programming. This work includes conducting professional development workshops for teachers, speaking to student assemblies, and developing inclusive curricula centered on social studies. In the classroom, Hasan takes great pride in opening students' minds to new ways of understanding the past and present. This has led him to push the very boundaries of what we think of as a classroom, including taking small groups of undergraduates to James Madison's Montpelier, the Virginia plantation home of the nation's fourth president, to explore the history of race and racism in America from slavery to present. For his pedagogical creativity and effectiveness, he has received Ohio State's Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching, the university's highest award to teaching, and the Ohio State University of College of Arts and Sciences Outstanding Teaching Award. To our network of teachers, both nationally and internationally, and without further ado, I present to you our scholar and leader for this session, Hasan Kwame Jeffries. Hasan, we're honored to have you with us. We're honored to have you with us tonight. Yes, sir.
Brother Williams, thank you very much. It is the honor is totally mine. Thank you very much for the warm words of welcome and for extending the invitation to share some thoughts and ideas with your regular audience, teachers from across the country and internationally, and to support the wonderful work that the National Humanities Center continues to do. I did my graduate work, as you pointed out, at Duke University, and the Humanities Center was just around the corner. So it's a little bit of a homecoming to be able to share this evening with you all. So thank you very much. I want to dive right on in, ladies and gentlemen. First, thank you all for attending this evening, and I want to share some thoughts on this topic, the book project that I'm working on, but really, entitled "In the Shadow of Civil Rights." But really, what I'm trying to do, what I'm looking at, is the Black experience after the traditional civil rights era. So moving from the 70s into the 80s, right? So reimagining, interpreting what the 1980s, what the African American experience was like in the immediate aftermath of the civil rights era. I want to begin, though, by talking about or identifying or getting us on the same page about what I call hard history. What I call hard history. Hard history, in my mind, is so those experiences in our collective past that make us uncomfortable in the present. Those experiences, those aspects of history in our collective past that make us uncomfortable in the present. The image that you have before you is of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who in 1963 was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, as he was participating in and helping to lead efforts to desegregate Alabama, desegregate Birmingham, America's Johannesburg, the most segregated city in America. And of course, when he is arrested and jailed in Birmingham in April of 1963, it is from the Birmingham jail where he writes, or out of the Birmingham jail, while he's in jail in Birmingham, that he writes a letter from Birmingham jail, which is arguably, I think you can make a good argument, the most significant piece of 20th century literature that an African American, that an American has written. I think the most significant 18th century sort of piece of literature, if you will, broadly defined, might be the Declaration of Independence. In the 19th century, I would say it's the Gettysburg Address. And in the 20th century, I would say that it's Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. Interestingly enough, when Ohio, the state of Ohio, in which I reside, most recently got caught up in that wave of anti-education, anti-honesty in education, anti-critical race theory, all this nonsense and madness, they decided that we at the college level weren't doing a very good job of teaching American history. And so they identified 4 or 5 texts that would be required in U.S. history classes. And one of those texts, quite surprisingly, but not that much so if you think about it, was Letter from Birmingham Jail. And so people say, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with the selection has everything to do with hard history, right? Because as one of my colleagues said, they want us to teach Letter from Birmingham Jail, but they don't want us to teach the reason why Dr. King was in jail in the first place, because that opens up the kind of history that makes people uncomfortable. Why was Dr. King in jail? Why was he challenging white supremacy? Why were dogs unleashed by the police on children who were fighting in the streets of Birmingham for the right to be treated as human beings? So instead of actually confronting hard history, instead of, and I would classify the civil rights movement, slavery as an era of, really represents an era of hard history that we don't want to deal with. Aspects of the defeat of Reconstruction. Reconstruction didn't fail. Reconstruction was defeated by the forces of white supremacy, an aspect of hard history. Jim Crow, hard history. We don't want to deal with white supremacy and lynching and racial terrorism. And civil rights, hard history. We don't want to deal with segregation. We don't want to deal with racial terrorism. We don't want to deal with the fact that, people like George Wallace weren't renegades, but rather they were duly elected officials of their respective states. So rather than confront hard history, we tend to do several things, but critically important, and this was an observation about why we don't actually confront these aspects of our past that make us uncomfortable. This was an observation that was made by a friend of mine, and it truly is profound. Reggie Gibson, he's a literary interpreter out of Boston, and Reggie Gibson observed that we as Americans, we actually hate history. He said we hate history, particularly those aspects of history that make us uncomfortable. We hate history. He said what we actually love is nostalgia. Now, there's a difference between hard history and nostalgia, between history and nostalgia. He said we hate history, we love nostalgia. We love stories about the past that make us feel good about ourselves in the present, that make us feel comfortable in the present, right? So rather than confronting those difficult aspects, those difficult stories and narratives of the past that inform the present, we fall back on this thing called nostalgia. Stories about the past that make us feel comfortable in the present, regardless of whether or not they are true. regardless of whether or not they are true. So rather than confront hard history directly, rather than deal with the truth of the civil rights movement, we tend to do a couple things. The first thing we tend to do is we engage in purposeful historical amnesia. Purposeful historical amnesia. We pretend as though these elements of the past, these elements of hard history, just simply didn't happen. We're going to pretend as though Dr. King offers us this letter from Birmingham jail, but we're going to pretend as though he wasn't in jail. He wasn't defying the law of the land, right? Purposeful historical amnesia. The other thing that we do is we attempt, and just think about this as you think about the American past, but in this instance, the civil rights movement, we attempt to rationalize evil, right? So rather than deal with the fact that the state was engaged in a effort to maintain white supremacy through the use of force and violence, that this was widespread and accepted for the first 2/3 of the 20th century, we will attempt to rationalize the use of racial terrorism to suppress equality by saying it was committed by just a handful of people, right? We attempt to rationalize a society's use of violence by saying, that was just the Klan. That was just a handful of people who were really out of step with everyone else. This might be the first and only time that you hear a black person say this, that the Klan gets a bad rap because they get blamed for everything. It wasn't the Klan that was primarily responsible for racial violence and racial terrorism and lynching in the United States, certainly during the civil rights era and throughout the South. It was everyday white people. It was black folks' neighbors, right? But we attempt to rationalize away that evil in so many different ways in the civil rights movement by putting it on by blaming it on just a handful of people. And the third thing that we do is we create false narratives. Rather than dealing with hard history directly, rather than confronting honestly the past, we create these false narratives. Now, arguably, the greatest false narrative that we have collectively created in the United States is the lost cause. And by creating false narratives, what I'm saying is we just make stuff up, right? Just making stuff up. The lost cause is just a made-up analysis or a reinterpretation of what slavery was, or in other words, this benign institution that didn't impact anybody, then this is a positive good. What the Civil War was all about, this idea that it wasn't fought about slavery, but something else that I'm still waiting for Nikki Haley to explain. That Reconstruction was, a failed political effort, and that redemption and the rise of white supremacy, of course, was actually an effort to save democracy rather than subvert it. So we create these false narratives, and we've done the same thing. We've done the same thing with the civil rights movement. We've created what Julian Bond, the former, who passed away a few years ago, former activist with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee out of Atlanta, Georgia, went on, was a lifelong activist, a student at Morehouse College when the student sit-ins began, winds up becoming sort of the director of communication with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, eventually would run for office, state legislature in Atlanta, in Georgia. The Georgia State Legislature refused to seat him in 1966, very much like we just saw in Tennessee last year. But later on in his life, Julian Bond was a teacher, a professor at the University of Virginia, and he talks about this master narrative, that this fiction of the civil rights movement that has been created to explain what the movement was and what the movement was not. And the first element, I just want to take a few minutes here to go over some of the critical elements in the master narrative, because they speak to why we misinterpret and overlook what happens in places like New York City, not only during the civil rights movement, but after the civil rights movement, after the civil rights era, and why we really don't understand or misunderstand what happens during those eras outside of the South. So the master narrative has a couple areas, core characteristics that are critically important to understand. The first is that it's overwhelmingly king-centric. That is king-centric. You know, nothing against Dr. King. Dr. King was an amazing activist who gives his life in the cause for freedom. But the movement was bigger than Dr. King. The movement was more than Dr. King. So there's two problems with this sort of king-centric aspect that we find in the master narrative. One, this idea that King was the movement, and that the movement was king. Obviously, the movement is much bigger than Dr. King. I'll say more about that in a second. But also, the king that we get isn't even a king worth anything, right? You know, it's a watered down, deracialized, de-radicalized version of the person who actually lived, and he is very much frozen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, as he is in this image, you know, preaching about colorblindness. King was anti-capitalist. Dr. King was anti-racist. Dr. King believed in reparations. Dr. King believed in color-conscious problems to racist solutions to racist problems or problems caused by race. And so part of the problem with this master narrative is the obsession with Dr. King, but not even the Dr. King who actually lived. And that leads to a whole series of falsities that have shaped how we talk and discuss the civil rights movement and the civil rights era. The first thing is we tend then to frame the chronology of the movement to the years in which Dr. King was most active. So 1955 is the beginning of the bus boycott. Some may stretch back all the way a whole year to 1954 and the Brown decision, and push it to 1965, which is the passage of the Voting Rights Act, or which was a part of King's Selma campaign, or if they're really getting ambitious, all the way to 1968 and King's assassination in Memphis, Tennessee. The problem with that is the movement is much broader chronologically, or Black protest is much broader chronologically than just this decade plus, right? And it's a critical era, 55 to 65, largely because we see Black protests rising to a level that we just haven't seen before in terms of garnering public attention and gaining real victories at the federal level in terms of legislation. So it warrants our attention. But when we focus too narrowly or confine Black protests or confine the Black experience in many instances just to this 10-year, decade-plus period, we'll go from slavery, you might touch about advance to the Civil War, might give a little bit about Reconstruction, then you're going to jump all the way a century forward to this period, then you miss Black folk actually doing stuff. It's like, well, what were Black people doing for the 2/3 of a century before then? As though they were just sitting around waiting for Moses in the form of Dr. King to come down and lead them to the promised land. No, they are engaged in protest. They are engaged in a constant struggle. One of the key themes of the Black experience is the persistence of resistance, And that is lost when with this master narrative and the focus on Dr. King in this narrow 10-year period. So the chronology is off. It's too narrow, right? It doesn't mean the movement began in 1619 when Black folk arrived on these shores in chains, but it does mean that Black resistance to white supremacy begins in 1619. There is never a moment where Black people are not fighting for their freedom. But it doesn't always rise to the level of a social movement, which we'll talk about a little bit later, only in these, for 400 years. It's impossible to maintain a social movement for 400 years, for 4 decades, even for 4 years, sometimes for 4 months, right? So they're too hard to sustain. But that doesn't mean that you don't have Black protests before and after. The master narrative, the geography, tends to center itself on the South. In other words, think about it. The movement is not only Dr. King, but the movement is where Dr. King was. All right. So it becomes about Georgia. It becomes about Alabama. It becomes about Mississippi. It becomes wholly Southern. The goal becomes federal legislation, right? This master narrative. The goal becomes federal. Everything is about federal legislation, right? So just as the geography of the master narrative of the South, when you focus solely on the South, what happens is you wind up missing everything that's going on beyond the South, right? Everything that's going on in the West, everything that's going on in the North, everything that's going on in the Midwest. It becomes solely a Southern struggle. And when the goal is when we frame the goal solely as federal legislation, then all of the efforts of African Americans to secure what I call freedom rights, this broad range of civil rights and human rights. So they're not only fighting for, laws to deal with segregation, which they understand are necessary, they're also fighting for a broad spectrum of human rights, which include quality education. The Constitution doesn't say anything about education. Decent housing. The Constitution doesn't say anything about housing. Healthcare. I mean, these are things that Black folk are fighting for from the moment of emancipation up to and through the 1960s. That's critically important. And the master narrative just gives us, Black people are fighting for a new bill up in the White House. They're just lobbying Congress people up in Washington, D.C., right? So the goal and the goals of the movement become reduced to federal legislation in this master narrative. The tactics become mobilizing large-scale demonstrations, right? The movement then becomes, in this master narrative, about marches, large-scale marches. This is why we're partly obsessed with 1963 and the March on Washington. Right? I mean, that was one day, one Sunday afternoon, 250,000 people. Right? We become obsessed with the March on Washington. You know what the number one story was? The number one story, the number one headline after the March on Washington was not Dr. King's speech, not the demands of people, not even a reframing of the actual title of the protest, which was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The headlines were Negroes don't burn down Washington, D.C. Wasn't nobody paying attention to the March on Washington in the way that we frame it today. But it was a march. It was an important march. It was large scale. But we look back and interpret these large, or reduce the civil rights movement to these large scale demonstrations because it becomes civil rights made easy, right? We look and we say, okay, wherever there's a lot of people gathered, whoever's standing, that's where the movement happens. Whoever's standing in front of the microphone, that person is the leader, right? So that, of course, is problematic because it ignores all the people who were organizing, and are not in front of a camera, all the day-to-day work that people are doing, knocking on doors, canvassing, attending mass meetings, attempting to register to vote, building Black businesses, building Black institutions. All of that organizing, institution building suddenly disappears. So if it ain't a march, it ain't happened. All right. That's part of the problem of the master narrative. Similarly, that King-centric focus reduces everything to nonviolence. It makes nonviolence, a philosophical nonviolence, right, the norm, right, normative. And everything outside of nonviolence somehow becomes problematic or abnormal. When the reality is, one of the things that makes this period, the conventional period of the civil rights movement, so mid to the early part of the mid 20th century, unique, is the introduction of nonviolence, philosophical nonviolence as a way of life. Now, look, Black folk have been using nonviolent tactics since they've been engaged in this fight to end white supremacy from day one. Like, that is nothing new. But what is new is embracing nonviolence philosophically. And that's coming into the African American community through a whole series of pacifists, some who are white, some are interracial pacifists, some white, some Black, war resistors and the like, drawing inspiration in some instances from Mohandas Gandhi, drawing inspiration in some instances like Dr. King from his from his deep Christian religious beliefs, but it's only a handful of people who subscribe to nonviolence philosophically as the guiding philosophical approach to creating change. Most black folk, believe in racial solidarity. They believe in institution building. Broadly framed, they believe in black nationalism, right? This idea that black folk coming together to build institutions, to protect one another, to support one another, is what black people are committed to, because that's what enabled them to survive slavery. That's what enabled them to survive the transition to freedom. That's what enabled them to survive the resurgence of white supremacy at the turn of the 20th century. That's what they will default back to when confronted with the violent backlash to efforts to create equality during the civil rights era. The default response of African Americans to racial terrorism and the response to the civil rights organizing, civil rights struggle is armed self-defense. That's critically important. Critically important. That's the default response. So when we see it outside the South, when we see organizations like the Black Panthers, when we see organizations who are willing to challenge the police, when we see organizations and folk who are like, there's no reason for us to back down, when we hear Malcolm X saying we have a right to defend ourselves, that is actually resonating with black folks, because that is the default response of black folks. That's how black people have responded and survived this long journey in the wilderness, if you will. Nonviolence is what is unique. And so afterward, once we sort of push beyond that nonviolent moment, if you will, philosophically, we still see the tactics, but philosophically, black folk are turning back to black nationalism. That's what we will see later on, not only in urban spaces like New York City and Detroit, Michigan, and Oakland, California, but also in the South as well. All right. So we misinterpret the South by following this king-centric approach to understanding of the movement. I mentioned a little bit earlier, this master narrative reduces the problem that black folk face to bad actors, right? To bad apples. It's just one or two white people who really were out of step with the rest of, sort of Southern society. That's nonsense. Right? It was Southern society white Southern society that was maintaining Jim Crow. It was white Southern society that said lynching was the proper response to black efforts to secure equality. And that's critically important that we understand that. Because one of the things that it also does is focus on the individuals, say, hey, it was just Jim Connor, Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama. He was really the problem. Or Jim Clark, the sheriff down in Selma. He was really the problem. Suddenly, if it's the problem and not the society, if it's the problem and not the structures, if it's the police chief who's the problem and not policing, then the solution to the problem is real simple. Just remove these individuals, just remove the bad people, right? Well, if that's the case, once you got rid of Bull Connor, once you got rid of a Jim Clark, then the problem of police violence should have evaporated, and obviously it did not, right? So the master narrative ignores the structures that have created inequality and that racist actors, both consciously and unconsciously, have engaged in to maintain racial inequality. And lastly, we also in the master narrative have reduced movement victories or movement success to a formula that involves proximity to whiteness. So in other words, the movement around quality education is a success not if black folk are able to determine the content of their curriculums, not if black children are given adequate resources to learn, but simply and solely if black children are able to sit close to white kids. Now, look, I've been teaching at Ohio State for 20 years. I've been teaching a lot of white children. I can tell you this, ain't nothing magical about white children. Other than their ability to attract tax dollars and resources wherever they go. So, what we see then, this emphasis on proximity to whiteness is really about making white people feel comfortable with this hard history. And one of the aspects about hard history is that black folk understood that the most dangerous place to be historically for black people is in the presence of white people. So if black people understood this, then why are they pushing for desegregation in education? It's not because they're obsessed and want to be and just love white folk and trying to sit next to white folk. Many black parents were like, there's no way I'm sending my children to a white school. What we want is quality education and the resources to provide this to our children. But we also realize that strategically that this is not going to happen on equal terms unless our children are sitting in the same building and in the same classroom as white kids. But this, if we understand that proximity to whiteness isn't the goal, but rather access to resources is the goal, then we have a better understanding of the efforts around community control of schools in places like New York City in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, particularly, rather than simply believing that black folk are just trying to sit next to white folk because of their obsession with proximity to whiteness. Now, keep all of that as background. And Mike, I'm not sure if there are any questions that popped up that we should address, but I want to keep that as background as we begin to shift our gaze towards the North and looking at New York City.
Absolutely. Thank you for laying that foundation, and we appreciate that. And I will encourage. I've seen a few questions pop up in the audience chat, and I want to remind you all, if you have any questions that you would like to bring to Dr. Jeffries' attention, please enter them in the managed Q&A chat. There was a question that came up, and I suspect that as we continue on in the evening, the answers will come for that. But Queenie's question was, what is the best approach to actually learn about hard history through a true and honest narrative? How do we stop ourselves from unknowingly subscribing to these false master narratives? And I suspect one is based on the items that you outlined as teachers, focusing on approaches that incorporate multiple perspectives. Those actors and everyday advocates who were involved in the struggle, and moving away from the King ethos to bring in more, of the people who are actively involved in the movements. But that's a question that we have. If you want to speak to that, or we can wait on that. But as teachers, what are some approaches for moving away from the master narratives?
No, it's a great question. And I think obviously one of the approaches is we got to do some homework. We got to do some heavy lifting as educators, and being a part of this webinar series is connected to that. As I move through the rest of the presentation and talk about New York City, I mean, this is one of the ways to challenge this master narrative, right? Is thinking about if King becomes the center of sort of the pivot around which the master narrative turns, then one of the things that we have to do is we have to look where King wasn't, right? No matter where you are, there's going to be movement activism. The civil rights movement and black protest is very much like the night sky, right? Very much like the night sky. When you look up at the night sky, depending upon where you are, you realize that there is a star covering every inch of the night sky. I grew up, as you mentioned, in Brooklyn, New York. It wasn't until I first visited as a preteen. I had the fortune of going over to Ghana. And I remember my first night in Ghana was like, oh my God, there is a star in every inch of the sky. I mean, it was so bright. Because of the light pollution growing up in Brooklyn, New York, I didn't realize that there was a star, that the night sky was so bright. That's what the movement was, right? Every single one of those stars, if you will, represents a different black community. Now, you can't always see the stars, but that doesn't mean that they're black. They're not there. They're always there. And in that, the illumination is the protest of those in those communities. Sometimes those stars burn a little brighter, right? That's the intensity, and it becomes visible. But just because you don't see it, just because you don't see the marches, or demonstration doesn't mean that they're not engaged in protest. So when we think about sort of challenging the master narrative, all we got to do is go and look at the places where Black folk are in the communities and begin to search for those stars, to search for those lights. And if it's a little dim, you just got to dig a little harder. And then when we see the constellations, you think about the night sky and the constellations, that's when we're moving from protest to actually movement activism, right? And you have different movement organizations like the NAACP or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, these professional organizers and Ella Baker, who are connecting the stars through their activism. They represent the constellation. So in short, we got to do a little homework to bring in these local movements so that we can contest the master narrative. And once you do that, then think about it. Suddenly, you're not just talking about King. You will not just be talking about 1955 and 1965. Now you're talking about Los Angeles. Now you're talking about New York. And when you start doing that, you realize that people are fighting for more than local federal legislation. They're fighting for access to jobs. They're fighting for decent housing. They're doing more than just marching and demonstrating. They're actually organizing schools and the like. They certainly aren't just engaged in nonviolence, and they're contesting structures. They understand this isn't about bad people. This is about structures, and they're building institutions of our own, which pushes them beyond simply striving for proximity to whiteness. So I would say that becomes one of the critical things that we all can do, no matter where we are. Look for the communities of Black folk, and in that, we will find our way beyond the master narrative. And one of the things, Mike, sort of transitioning back to some of the slides, is that one of the difficulties, one of the challenges that we have in dealing with sort of movement activism, Black protest outside of the South and beyond the master narrative, is our deep desire to be on the right side of history. I grew up in New York, in Brooklyn, New York, and not one time, not one class can I recall being taught about slavery existing in New York City, right? Slavery, of course, existed in every single one of the 13 colonies. Slavery will continue in New York up until 1827, right? So this is almost half a century after the American Revolution, right? You still have slavery legally existing in New York, and it will be another 20 years before we see the complete abolition of slavery in New York, because people were still allowed to bring enslaved laborers into New York City, right? So the desire to be on the right side of history, then leads us to forget about these stories, right? And specifically to forget about manifestations of white supremacy outside of the South. So white supremacy then becomes a Southern thing. It becomes racism, then becomes something that happened down there. Because of course, slavery didn't exist, in New York or in Ohio. So therefore, we are on the right side of history. We're on the right side of the Civil War. Racism, therefore, is something that happened down there. The problem with our desire to be on the right side of history when it comes to the institution of slavery, and this then informs everything that comes after, right? So if we're not talking about slavery existing outside the South and in the colonies and beyond, that informs everything that comes after, because suddenly our students, in their minds, believe that racism and white supremacy is something that happens down there in the South. Therefore, after the Civil War, everything that Black folk are facing, all the shortcomings that they face, inequality that they face, isn't based on white supremacy. It's certainly based on their own individual shortcomings, right? Like that's it. It becomes their own individual shortcomings, right? They don't see the structures of white supremacy. They don't see how racism was a national understanding, a national approach to engaging with Black folk, and not just a Southern approach. And so what we wind up then missing out on is the way that inequality is actually structured in places like New York, in places like Oakland, California, in places like Cleveland and Columbus, Ohio. And of course, for all of the major metropolitan areas, you can look at the redlining maps. These are great maps. Again, talking about, well, how can we move beyond the master narrative? You got to deal with the structure inequality that is intentionally and purposefully created, and you can get maps. Maps are wonderful teaching tools. you get these redlining maps and you lay them out before your students and you say, okay, what's going on here, right? How are we creating defined neighborhoods that not only limiting wealth and creating wealth and opportunities for others, but denying opportunities for African Americans and eventually for people of color? That is critically important. If we don't talk about the way in which inequality and racism is structured outside of the South, then what Black folk are fighting against will not make any, what they're fighting for will not make any sense, because we haven't explained what they're actually fighting against. Like, that's critically important. So talking about the ways in which inequality is written into the lives of Black folk becomes critically important, because you can't teach what Black people are fighting for unless our students understand what Black people are fighting against. But one of the obstacles towards teaching this history in a really accurate way, towards teaching sort of structural inequality in an accurate way, is nostalgia. Right? Again, going back to that first point that my friend Reggie Gibson made, that we hate history, but we love nostalgia. We love stories about the past that make us feel good. Well, here's a classic example. Growing up in Brooklyn, New York, you hear so much about Jackie Robinson. Right? We're coming up on the 77th anniversary of Jackie Robinson desegregating Major League Baseball. I love Jackie Robinson. Right? My dad and my uncle were kids growing up and going to Brooklyn Dodger games. Right? Love Jackie Robinson. But there's a myth around Jackie Robinson, much like Dr. King, that has Jackie Robinson frozen in 1947, right, on April 15th, the date that he desegregates or reintegrates Major League Baseball. And it's centered around the nostalgia of the Brooklyn Dodgers. The Brooklyn Dodgers, of course, were terrible until Jackie Robinson joins the team in 1947. And then you get a few other Black players, Roy Campanella and the like, and they go on this torrid run, right, from 1947 to 1957. But this isn't just a sports story. Suddenly, the embrace of these Black first Black folk in baseball suddenly gets expanded out to the rest of Brooklyn and the rest of New York City. So if Black folk, if some Irish and Italians in Brooklyn could root for the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they had a couple Black ball players on their team, then suddenly this meant that racism didn't exist in New York City, right? Because everyone was bleeding Dodger blue. You didn't have time enough to talk about Black and white. And of course, that's just a misnomer. That's the nostalgia for a past that didn't exist, because Jackie Robinson was facing racial discrimination. He couldn't find a house when he was looking for a home. Not to mention the fact that Jackie Robinson, not only after his playing baseball career, was an outspoken activist until his death in 1972. And all of that gets erased because of our obsession with this moment and our obsession with first. It's another aspect of the master narrative, right? It's this idea that Black folk are just fighting to become the first in this, the first in that. Jackie Robinson wasn't interested in just being the first. He wanted to be the first of many. But when we stop the story at just the first, then the broader struggle what Black people are fighting for gets lost. And so the nostalgia for these moments when we can see people or believe people were turning away from racism and from discussions and conversations of race, bleeding Dodger blue, and turning away from the color line, then suddenly we miss out on the ways in which inequality continued to be structured in our community, right? In New York City in the 1960s. Now this connects, right? So in the 1930s, we get these redlining maps. This is how America is going to come out of the Great Depression, by building up the investment in housing. But then after in mortgages, in individual homeowners, creating America's middle class. But then you've created these communities that are deemed of low value, right? Forget about the people who are there, and they become the roots and the routes for American modernization. And so in New York City, with the famous sort of czar of infrastructure, Robert Moses, and he's building these major thoroughfares that are crisscrossing New York City. Not ironically, not surprisingly, the location for these tend to be overwhelmingly, almost in every instance, Black communities. And it's the same thing. We see this happening over and over and over again. And so Black communities, and in New York City, we're talking about Black communities. We're talking about Latino communities, Puerto Rican communities in particular in New York City. Right? So Black and brown communities become the target of American modernization, and it has a devastating effect on sort of the communities that were there as you're bulldozing and building these roads that are crisscrossing the city. And, no matter where you go, I mean, one of the good things that you can do as educators in talking about structural inequality is looking at those redlining maps and then moving to the 1950s and 1960s and looking at where interstates, right, are placed, right, and then asking children, say, okay, now what was here before this interstate was here? Why does it look like, why do you think that this interstate was placed here? And you can layer those maps, and they become really clear. Now, one of the things that I want to in the project as a whole, this book project that I'm working on, sort of where I begin. There's always this tendency, and I'm a victim of it too, of wanting to establish context. And context is so critically important, and we can go back and back and back in time. Well, in a webinar, we can spend a little time talking about context, but you got to start the story someplace. And so I start the story in 1977 in New York City, right? Because in 1977 we have that major blackout. I begin the book talking about when the lights come back on. What is it that Black folk, that Latinos are facing in New York City, when the lights come back on? And one of the things that we see is almost complete and total urban abandonment, both in terms of housing and in unemployment. And you can Google the images of the South Bronx in the 1970s, famously Howard Cosell, sort of looking out, over into the Bronx as he's announcing a Yankee game and says the Bronx is burning. Well, the Bronx was burning intentionally, not set by fires, not set by residents, but by sort of housing, large-scale housing owners who were reaping the benefits of insurance claims, fire departments, as New York City went through its financial crisis, fire departments that were being shuttered in Black and brown communities in the South Bronx, but also in Bedford-Stuyvesant and Bushwick in New York City. And so the housing abandonment was real. And at the same time, unemployment is reaching crisis levels in the 1970s and would only get worse in the 1980s for African Americans as we move into a national recession, but also in industry in New York City was evaporating. And so when we think about sort of what is the context that Black folk are dealing with, housing becomes so critically important. Had already been confined to these to a handful of neighborhoods, were not allowed to get mortgages, denied mortgages, couldn't move out of these neighborhoods, were doing their best to hold on and survive, and are just being bombarded, right, with disinvestment and declining and decaying housing. Oh, that is so critically important, because housing, where you live, is really the locus, the point of entry into opportunity. Where you live determines the kind of schools you're able to go to. Where you live determines your proximity to jobs. Where you live determines your access to healthcare, right? So housing becomes critically important, and the housing stock is decaying, intentionally being abandoned, and unemployment is high. So how do Black folk respond, right? Because this isn't just a story of misery. How do Black folk respond? For African American youth, they begin this new cultural expression, which becomes so critically important, right? That is hip hop. Right? We just marked the 51st anniversary. Last year was the 50th anniversary if you will, of the birth of hip hop. If you get a chance, PBS did a wonderful documentary, 4-part documentary that I had a small hand in called "Fight the Power: How Hip Hop Changed America, How Hip Hop Changed the World." Excuse me, it was truly becomes a global phenomenon. So if you get a chance to check that out, four episodes, and it still wasn't enough time to cover all the aspects of what hip hop actually was and its evolution and what it meant. But the first episode really does a terrific job of laying the groundwork, right, for what it was that Black youth are responding to, right? They're responding to the housing decay. They're responding to the unemployment. They're responding to the disinvestment. They're responding to the decline in social services and municipal services, right, that are very much a part of what's happening in New York City and urban spaces around the country. That's critically important. Netflix actually did a series some of you may have seen a few years ago, still available, called The Get Down. It's a wonderful dramatization of the Bronx at this period, late 1970s, a little bit earlier, really in the mid 1970s, as we see African American and Latino Puerto Rican youth responding to the crisis that they see. Now, hip hop becomes critically important because this becomes the cultural expression of Black youth, Black and brown youth, to the conditions that they are seeing. Part of it is escape, right? Like, how can we just chill? How can we get a little breathing room from the space and from these spaces and these places? But as hip hop begins to evolve, as hip hop begins to mature, then it also becomes a critique. For those who tuned in a little bit early, Mike Williams was playing the wonderful walk-up music, if you will, and Grandmaster Flash and The Message, right? This becomes, by the time we get to Grandmaster Flash, a critique of what life was like, of America, the nation, turning a blind eye, purposefully turning a blind eye to the conditions that many folk were many youth, but Black people and people of color were suffering during the late 1970s, but certainly during and through the 1980s and the Reagan years. As we push into the 1980s, though, what do we see? Right, youth then become the targets of the war on drugs. Right, so we go from Black and brown kids who hanging out, just chilling, trying to make a way, and then suddenly they become no longer just chilling and handing out. They become the targets of the war on drugs. In other words, this is how the nation responds to Black efforts to actually do something within their communities. The mayor at the time was Ed Koch, and Ed Koch makes a run. He becomes mayor in part by saying that the problems that New York City is facing, the problems of urban decay, the problems of urban decline, are all simply a result of, or largely a result of Black and brown youth. The problem is graffiti, right? Graffiti seen not as an expression of youth, as one of the core elements of hip hop, the artistic, visual, artistic expression of Black youth, but it's seen as a nuisance, right? And then that quickly evolves into targeted efforts to round up those who may or may not be involved in narcotics trafficking. One of the things that happens in New York City and will happen around the country as we move into the mid 1980s, and this is critically important, is we see the introduction of crack cocaine. No surprise, and that's no big revelation to anybody who was here. The introduction of crack cocaine is really critically important to the war on drugs, because what happens in the 1980s is we don't see in New York or any place else a significant change in drug usage rates. The rate of drug use is essentially flat. It doesn't change. What the introduction of crack cocaine does, though, is it actually democratizes the drug trade. It allows more people to become involved in narcotics trafficking. It takes it takes the narcotic trade out of the hands of large-scale organized crime and puts it on the corners. And by putting it on the corners, one of the things that we see is, New York City becomes very violent, right? And it becomes violent because people are now fighting over corners and control of corners, right? I mean, that's what crack cocaine does more so than anything else, right? It democratizes the drug trade, making it a battle for corners, and that's critical. But how we respond as a nation to the perceived the perceived expansion of drugs is to criminalize not just narcotics trafficking and make it penalties more extreme. And out in California, very soon we'll be talking about 3 strikes, but also criminalizing any connection to drug paraphernalia, right? So one of the things that then becomes illegal is actually possessing drug paraphernalia. Although crack is being introduced, heroin is still being used in large-scale numbers. And so one of the things that happens once you criminalize drug paraphernalia, once you criminalize possession of needles, is that IV drug users will increasingly share needles rather than be caught and face a criminal prosecution because they had needles. And this is happening at the same time as we see the rise of HIV/AIDS. Now, the story of HIV/AIDS, and particularly how we tend to focus on it, tends to be sort of on the activism of white gay men, and particularly on the coast, but even in a place like New York City. I mean, one of the things that when we look in the 1980s is we see that, again, the persistence of black resistance, that gay black men begin in 1986 to say, wait a minute, what we've seen already in terms of the activism is entirely centered too much on white men, right? On gay white men. And so they organize their own group that focuses on the plight and the struggle of gay black men, gay men of African descent, is organized in 1986 to do some of the work and draw attention and to shine a spotlight on the ravages of HIV/AIDS within the African American community. So it's part of that activist tradition, right? Where there is a problem, you will see that black folk, even those within the African American community who are very much marginalized within the community as gay black men and members of the gay community were in the 1980s, that did not stop them from engaging in protests very much in the tradition of African American activists. In the 1980s in New York City, racial terrorism was still a problem that black folk had to face. And it wasn't just racial terrorism emanating from the police. You had racial terrorism very much in the tradition that we saw in the South, coming from white communities and from white vigilantes. 2 cases in particular really stand out and really exemplify some of what we saw in the 1980s. One of those, of course, was Bernard Getz, serving as a vigilante in New York City, believing that or arguing, there were four black kids, 4 black young men, that they posed a threat to them. And he opens up and winds up shooting those 4 and essentially walks as a result of it, because they said, white jurors believed essentially that, fearing black people was legitimate, right? Fearing black youth was legitimate. And in the other picture, standing on the left side of the image, left side of that picture, is a young Yusef Hawkins. Young brother who winds up being murdered as he moved into a segregated white neighborhood of Bensonhurst to legitimately engage in a transaction, a business transaction, but he gets caught over there and quote unquote being in the wrong place, being in the wrong neighborhood, and literally gets killed. Right? Now, how do black folk respond? One of the ways, again, you have a tradition of activists. And so one of the things that we see black folk responding is in a very traditional way. This is an image some 30 years, 40 years ago of in the middle with the classic black sweatsuit, Reverend Al Sharpton, along with a number of other activists, including Alton Maddox, which was a attorney activist in New York City at the time, headed out into Bensonhurst to draw attention to the murder of young brother Yusef Hawkins, and the criminal assault or the extra legal assault on African American people in the 1980s, of course, wasn't limited to, or the racial terrorism directed at black folk in the 1980s, of course, was not limited to those outside of the political system. Of course, in 1989, we find 5 black youth in Harlem being targeted, arrested, denied their legal representation, interrogated without their parents, et cetera, Part 5, and all wind up spending several years and in one case over a decade in prison. And of course, now they eventually all were exonerated, had nothing to do with it. But this was really reflective of the kind of environment and atmosphere that black folk, black and Latino youth were facing, black people in general were facing, right? Like we think about the violence of the 80s, like, oh, it was all connected to drug trafficking. And like, no. New York City was a violent place because racism has always been violent, right? It's always been violent. And it's not always just, we think about it now as sort of being police violence, but, Ahmaud Arbery, right? In 2020, those weren't police. Those were, regular white folk. And the same thing that we saw in Brooklyn and in New York City in the 1980s. Just a few more slides, and we'll see if there's some additional questions. We'll wrap it up. One of the things that's also very unique about 1980s New York City, that's really reflective of the black experience and the post-civil rights era, is that black folk remain committed to battling white supremacy internationally. Black folk have always had an international perspective, have always been thinking about the African diaspora, and we see that New York City becomes one of the centers for the Free South Africa, Free Tanzania effort in organizing and apartheid organizing, right? And so, a lot of times people will say, well, what happened to sort of all those activists? Well, they're still there, right? The focus isn't always, the attention they're not always getting, but sometimes we see that attention being shifted or directed on the work that they're doing, and we see that with the Free South Africa movement. That was a grassroots effort, a local effort, but also, of course, connected with the students at New York's various universities, including Columbia University, right? So we can't forget that the lessons that were learned during the traditional civil rights era get applied in this international context to bring pressure on the United States government and other governments to divest from South Africa, essentially an economic boycott, not unlike what we saw in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, to divest from South Africa and eventually to free Nelson Mandela. And it is no surprise that once Mandela is freed, announced his release from prison in March of 1990, that one of the first places that he visits is New York City, in part to pay tribute and offer thanks for the support to end apartheid. The consciousness around the Free South Africa movement wasn't something black folk didn't wake up in New York City in 1970s or 1980s and be like, hey, we think apartheid is a problem. We think the global color line is a problem. There had been a rich tradition of critique of Pan-Africanism in New York City, of Garveyism, right, going back to the 1920s. And in the 1980s, we see that really clustered in Harlem around sort of these community schools, community knowledge. And this is an image of Gil Noble, who was on the left side. Gil Noble was one of New York City's leading black journalists, and he had a television show that appeared on Sundays called Like It Is. And here are 3 scholars of the Afrocentric tradition, leading scholars of the Afrocentric tradition, seated left to right: Ivan Van Sertima, Dr. Joseph Van Yakinen, and Dr. John Henry Clark. And they're critical, right, in this sort of public discourse that is happening within the African American community, where they're trying to make sense not only of the color line locally but globally, trying to reclaim Africa. A lot of times, in the history of Africa, a lot of times, today I talk to teachers and they're like, we're not sure what to do about, dealing with these attempts to whitewash history. And I'm like, this stuff ain't nothing new. I don't say stuff. Like, Black folk have been dealing with this since public schools were first, and public education first began in the United States, right? And so all we have to do is look to the models that Black folk have. Now, in New York, the Afrocentrism, they're creating community schools. They're having lectures in Brooklyn, New York, at the Slave Theater, up in Harlem at First World Alliance, and to share and disseminate this information. And then we see it impacting the culture and spilling it over into the culture. This is a photo image of KRS-One, who in the late 1980s, we see reflected in the music and the hip hop that they are creating, the maturity as hip hop matures, reflecting this Afrocentric sensibility. And so KRS-One, among others, would talk about not just entertainment, but edutainment, right? And we listen to the lyrics of their songs, right? The emphasis on a Black consciousness, Black nationalism, on Afrocentricity. We see the infusion of sort of a religious nationalism, very much so connected to the Nation of Islam and the 5% Nation. Poor righteous teachers, for example, coming out of Trenton, New Jersey, but an influence certainly in that New York City tradition. So we see so much, especially in the North, in New York City, saying reflected in the music of hip hop, this tradition, or this what they're learning as young folk from these Afrocentric griots like Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben. And of course, in the 1980s, we also see literature and art, really producing and reflecting a critique of the society in which Black folk found themselves. Spike Lee coming out of Fort Greene and talking about and producing films like Do the Right Thing in 1989, that is really reflecting the challenges that Black folk are facing in their communities, but then also challenges they're facing and frustrations they're facing with police as well, right? And so, the Spike Lee really embodies, I think, that artistic expression in the mid and late 1980s. We also have to think about, when thinking about New York City, when we think about the Black experience, that Black folk, certainly are always engaged in struggle, but they're always looking for expressions to provide a little bit of relief, right? Not always optimistic about how things will change or how immediately they will change, but certainly always hopeful. And in the 1980s in New York City, we saw that there were a number of champion Black athletes leading New York teams to glory. On the left, we have New York in the New York Mets playing in Queens, certainly sort of a working class team, if you will. And their two superstars, Dwight Gooden, the pitcher, and Darryl Strawberry, hanging out with Iron Mike Tyson, sort of product of who's always connected with Bedford Stuyvesant, become the heavyweight champion of the world at the time. And then and the New York Mets will win the World Series in 1986. But then you also have to the right the New York Giants, led by their Hall of Famer Lawrence Taylor as a linebacker, Carl Banks, another linebacker, again leading their teams to glory, providing this sort of outlet for Black expression. But it has to be said as well that these stars, particularly Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry, and Lawrence Taylor, also all succumbed to addiction in the form of cocaine and these other issues. So though that would come out later, but it is part of the story as well that the problems were touched, particularly drug use, touched everyone. This last topic, and then we'll throw it open, see if there's some comments and thoughts. In 1989, Black elected officials, Black folk are really rallying around ways of creating change. There's a rich tradition of Black elected officials advocating and pushing change in New York City in the 70s and 1980s. One immediately has to think of Shirley Chisholm, Right? He said, if you're not given a seat at the table, bring your folding chair. Shout out to the brothers and the sisters down at the Alabama dock. Channeling the inner Shirley Chisholm. But here is David Dinkins, who will beat, and you'll see to the right, Rudy Giuliani, New York prosecutor, Southern District at the time. David Dinkins, who comes up out of the tradition of black elected officials and that sort of Harlem cohort, right? You had certain groups who were organized. Harlem becomes a center of political activity. It shifts a little bit later on to Brooklyn, channeling that inner Shirley Chisholm. But right now, it was David Dinkins, right, who was coming out of that Harlem tradition of activists, political activists, and political actors, dating back to Adam Clayton Powell, of course, and then Charlie Rangel, long time serving congressman. And let it be said that for black folk, for African Americans, for Latinos who were choosing to vote for David Dinkins, who captured the fancy of many white residents of the city as well, by talking about the city being this gorgeous mosaic, choosing to emphasize the best parts of the city and not the worst parts of the city, that we were always clear that Rudy Giuliani was out for himself. That was not a mystery. In the same way that folk in New York, black folk in New York, have been living with Donald Trump, were always clear that he was out for himself and that he was fine using, just as Rudy Giuliani was fine using white supremacy to advance his own individual cause. Ain't nothing new about the craziness of either one of them, because they made it clear who they were and where they stood. And if you study and take seriously the black experience in New York City and black politics and the rise of somebody like David Dinkins, it's clear where they stood all along. But that gorgeous mosaic began to show cracks in it very, very early on, and throughout the time, because it was aspirational. I mean, that's critically important. It was aspirational, right? The gorgeous mosaic, the tile pieces were there, but it wasn't fully formed as a beautiful picture, right? It was aspirational. And so in 1991, shortly before, in 1991, and then of course the election in 1993, you have the Crown Heights, what they call the Crown Heights riot, as members of the African American and Caribbean community are in conflict with a group of Hasidic Jews. It had been long simmering tension that gets exacerbated by police and policing in New York at the time, and really boils over. And that tension and the way it boils over, Rudy Giuliani will come in and ride that wave of sort of law and order. It's very familiar post-civil rights language of cracking down and supporting the police and too much violence and this, that, and the other, and not wanting to actually deal with the structures that create inequality, but rather, wanting to blame the problems, the structural problems that people are facing, the frustrations that they are facing with police and employment and violence, and that it's all real, and just blaming it on a handful of folk and riding into office, saying that, using an iron fist and cracking down on, busting heads and cracking heads is the way to solve things. This is what he uses to actually prevail. And it signals, this is where I sort of wrap up the book, but it signals the start of Republican conservative control of urban centers and urban areas, right? So the moment of sort of Democratic small d or large Democratic Party control of these urban centers, it happens at this moment where things are resource poor, right? But black folk are blamed for the shortcomings. And then lastly, I certainly don't want to end with Rudy Giuliani. I don't want to end with sort of an image of sort of destruction, but rather with an image of family and community. This is a photograph of a block party, right? That is taking place in Bedford-Stuyvesant, not too far, in fact, from where I went to church over on Madison Street. between Tompkins and Troop in the heart of Bedford-Stuyvesant. And this really embodies to me, what, in this instance, 1980s Brooklyn was all about, right? And it was family. It was community. And it was family and communities, families serving as the building blocks of community, and not necessarily sort of the, the nuclear families that, Black folk are always being blamed for never have existing, right? No. This was about family and community, writ large, where you could be a blood relative, but you don't have to be a blood relative, right? If you're on the block, you're a part of the community. And it was the community coming out, even when it was dangerous to do so, to say that this is who we are, this is where we belong. And it was the members of these communities, these folk right here who are captured in this picture. It was these folk who held these communities together when the rest of the nation was willing to turn their backs on them, willing to divest, willing not to support them with the municipal services that they needed, willing to ignore their votes. And it was these folk who are now being pushed out of these very same communities that they held together through gentrification, because they can't afford the rents. One of the things that we see in New York City is that there are certainly homeowners. You have Black folk who are holding and purchasing these homes. My parents, bought one of these row houses in Crown Heights in 1980, 1981 for $50,000 at 29% interest. I didn't stutter. 29% interest. And they paid and they stayed. But now most of the folk there were renters, right? I mean, these are multifamily homes. And once the rents go up and the property taxes go up, then they are forced out. It would be so wonderful if in thinking about, what life is like in these communities, these Black communities that have been redlined for so many years, to fast forward and say, well, 30 years from now, what would that community be like? It would be great if they could say and see and be like, wow, all of those things that we wished for are now here. The decent grocery stores, the safe streets, the wonderful, the municipal services, they're there, but the people who fought to keep life in these communities are no longer there. And that's part of the great tragedy. That's part of the great tragedy of that this post 1980s period, is the removal once again of Black folk and brown folk from these communities that were theirs, communities that they had given so much to. And so with that, we went a little bit long, but hopefully there's a couple questions we can hang out a little bit longer. I turn it back to my friend Mike Williams.
Absolutely. Just thank you so very much. Just shout out to everyone who's here. Such a shout out. I believe it's Fatima who indicated this is her first webinar, and she said she will definitely be back. And I see Bonnie Pineda as well. But one question that Mary had, and we can address this in the time that we have, however succinctly you want to address it. But a question is can you speak to the role of women during the post-civil rights narrative? Particularly, obviously, you mentioned Shirley Chisholm, and but can you speak to just the impact of women, whether in New York or just challenging that master narrative earlier? What role did women play?
Oh, absolutely. It's a great question. And so, one of the things that the master narrative does by focusing solely on Dr. King is that we look for either Dr. King or people who are just like Dr. King. We run around the nation looking for Southern Baptist preachers. And then we miss out on all of the women who are so critical to the movement. Women like Ella Baker then, and then years later. So in other words, what is the role of women, in the post-civil rights era? It's the same as their role was in the civil rights era. They are at the center of everything. They're not always the most visible. In New York City, you will see a little bit more of the visibility if you look at the local level, right? Because there's a longer tradition of them being visible than in the South. But they're still there, right? They are very much part of that constellation of stars burning brightly. And we find them engaged in every single one of these issue areas. We find them engaged in rent strikes. We find them engaged in cleaning up the streets and dealing with drug violence. We find them as mothers, for example, but they're not always mothers. Sometimes they're just plain activists, but sometimes mothers who are agitating for police reform. And so women are absolutely critical, and Black women are absolutely critical to understanding what happens in the 1980s. Now, we don't always, we have to deal with the real patriarchy within the African American community. So there isn't an equal representation of women in hip hop, certainly as artists. We're not talking about women, playing in major league sports. I mean, so there are these deficit areas. But when we look at the organizing, when we look at the community, when we look at who's attending churches, right? When we look at who's showing up and voting in the highest percentages, they are absolutely all women. You don't have the survival of these communities and their rebirth without the presence and the hard work of African American women of color, women from the Caribbean, women from Puerto Rico, from the Dominican Republic, sharing in that struggle.
Solid. Thank you so much. And I appreciate your final slide, family and community. And David actually picked up on that. And his question is what else can we do to make sure we are spreading Black joy in our histories? What else can we do to make sure we're spreading Black joy in our histories? From David.
Well, David, I'm so glad you brought that up. The first thing, before we get to making sure we spread it, is the point that you're making is that we have to spread it. We have to talk about it. And especially as teachers, right? Because if we only talk about the struggle and the pain, right, then what we wind up doing is turning off of our students to engaging and embracing with the community. Because nobody wants to be constantly in struggle, right? Nobody wants to, and there's a certain beauty in struggle, people fighting for their survival, people fighting to create change. I get that, I understand that. But the joy is what people will connect to, what our children will connect to, our young scholars, our young learners will connect to in terms of the humanity of Black folk, in terms of the humanity of people of color. And so you have to talk about the music. You have to talk about the art. You have to talk about the parties and the picnics, right? That people are finding joy even in the midst of pain when things are getting worse. But we have to put it in context, right? Black folk are always going to, and that's historically, even while Black folk were enslaved, they're like, look, we're going to find some time to chill, right? We're going to have a barbecue, right? Like, no matter what. But if that's all, just like we just can't focus on the pain, we just can't focus on the good stuff, right? We just can't focus on the joy because the two inform each other, right? So lead with the humanity. But, this is Black History Month. We just can't talk about Black folk having parties, right, and the music without talking about what is the music a response to. What are Black folk doing after they close the picnic tables, right? Like, what do they have to do to get those picnic tables out so they can have the block party and the music and the like? So it really is talking about both the expressions of joy, right? The expressions of Black love, the expressions of Black community, right? And you can look at, no matter where you are, whether in New York City or down south or out west, you look at, okay, what is this Black community doing? How are they coming together? What groups and organizations and teams are they supporting? But then also being very clear that this is done in a broader context. They are finding joy sometimes in places where you don't think joy is actually imaginable or even possible, and yet they did. And by doing that, you're able to connect our young learners, our young scholars to the humanity of Black folk, and that's critically important because they don't see the humanity. They don't get and connect with the humanity. They'll never be able to empathize and relate to the struggle. And in the end, that's what we want them to be able to do.
All right. Thank you. And again, thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Now it's about 33 minutes after the hour, and I will say this. Shauna's question is may we have a part 2 of this webinar, which will lead into release date for the book or timeline of the book so that we can continue to support you. I'll go ahead and make sure that we post your social media information at Prof. Jeffries, at Professor Jeffries, so ProfJeffries. Please follow him. Stay up to date on all that's happening with him and his travels. We wish you all the best. And again, as I said at the beginning of this webinar, I'm just so appreciative. I had a chance to cross paths with you on a number of occasions, and putting together this webinar series, it was so important that we included you in this. One final response from David, which says, "Thank you, Dr. Jeffries, for this wonderfully enlightened presentation. I have learned a great deal. I love your night sky analogy." And David, we're all going to take that with us. So, Hasan, I'm just going to let you know we're gonna take that one. That's this will be on demand, and I know people will latch on to it. So,
wonderful.
Again, just thank you. We appreciate it. And we are going to go ahead and close on out with a few closing comments now. I will let you know, Hasan, that we have you inspired the final song, which is from the Crooklyn soundtrack. People Make the World Go Round, the updated one. So I saw that, family and community, and immediately thought of that.
There we go.
Movie. Yeah. So again, we appreciate you.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. Thanks so much. Brooklyn out.
Right on. Peace. Again, everyone, please stay up to date with all that's happening at the National Humanities Center at our website, nationalhumanitiescenter.org. Also, the NHC education programs. We provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools they and their students need to make a difference. So please consider us in your giving. Next up, February the 15th. I've been talking about it for a little while now. Exploring Women and Girls of African Descent in 20th and 21st Century Speculative Fiction with Karima Jeffrey Leggett, Associate Professor, Department of English and Foreign Languages at Hampton University. She will be here on February the 15th. And I will tell you all, much like tonight, you all are going to enjoy the ride. Thus far, it's been a special series. It's been special because of you all. You show up, you engage in the chat, you drop links, resources. Thanks to Annie out of Virginia for all of the resources that you dropped in the chat. Thank you to everyone who weighed in tonight. We will see you all very, very soon, and I hope you all continue to have a productive week.
People make the world go round. Make the world go round. Trash man didn't get my trash today. Oh, why? Because